coined the phrase just right. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But I feel like I want to sprint though, because there's so much to do. There's so much potential. We have such a good, highly qualified staff here that I'm just so excited to work with each and every one of you. So and welcome, Dr. Ayo Magwood. What a beautiful name. I think this is going to be an outstanding session this afternoon. I was excited. I ran out to grab lunch because I had to hurry up and get back here. We know the space in which we work, which we live, which we thrive, which we teach, train, learn. We know how it is important to not only what we do professionally, but what we train other people to do and what we communicate to other people. We believe that in order for us to maintain some vestige of existence within our respective spaces, that we've got to make sure that we extend aspects of respectfulness, welcomeness, belongingness to all of those that would venture into the space, and even those who watch it from the outside looking in. Because as we know, there are many who for whatever reasons, whether it's political, spiritual, or whatever, decide to stand on the outside and look at what we're doing and look at the outcomes, but don't necessarily champion those, or would not necessarily have an interest in championing those. So our goal is to make sure that is the case. So it's good to have a good intellectual discourse, good intellectual conversation and discussion, albeit courageous and sometimes quite difficult, but it's important that we do engage it. So I'm so happy that we are here this afternoon for this purpose. So thank you so much. I know there's a whole lot to say, but I know there's a whole lot more to learn, and I'm excited to get into this discussion. So I'm just going to go ahead and clamp down on my end and open up these ears here and listen to all this other good information that's going to be coming out this afternoon. But again, thank you for welcoming me here, and thank all of you for coming out this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Dr.
Great, thank you, Dr.
What happened? Yeah, so Dr. Cecil, thank you so much for that. You are definitely in great company as I am seeing familiar faces, again, dedicated to move that equity needle just a little bit forward, and very talented staff in a Bobcat community. So again, we do have a couple folks from our office, and if I can have Cynthia do the introduction, and then we can popcorn from there, just to let you know that as this is somewhat of our official first event, right? We are very excited, but again, also acknowledge that these type of spaces and discourse, right, is critical and needed. And as we are slowly opening up our campus for our scholars to come in and to enjoy the beauty of what we call UC Merced and the Merced community, that again, as a collective is critical for us just to build these spaces. So Cynthia?
Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Cynthia Cortez, serving as Deputy Chief Diversity Officer, and just want to echo what Ona has shared. This is our first event for the semester, and it means a lot to have you here. As you know, this past year, tremendous amount of efforts have gone to think about how do we improve our campus climate? How do we diversify our faculty and our staff and really support our students in the way that they deserve? So thank you so much for joining us in this particular journey. Aya, we are very, very grateful. We are ready for this knowledge source because we know we need it. We need it to tailor our programs. We need it to have the tough conversations. We need it to make sense of what's happening in the world as it relates to student success. So hold on tight, everyone. It's going to be an amazing, amazing presentation, and look forward to the engagement throughout the session.
Oh, no, you're muted.
Hey, Desiree, did you want to introduce yourself? Sorry, I was unmuted. Okay, Hala?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hala Almjar, and I serve as the Inclusive Excellence Initiatives Coordinator in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I know I'm personally very excited to learn from Dr. Ayo Magwood.
Great. Wendy?
Hello, everyone. Apologies, I'm having some internet data issues, so I can't be on camera, but I'm very grateful to be here. I'm very excited about what we're going to talk about, and I can't wait to get started. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. And Desiree?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Desiree Kamala Cruz. I'm the executive assistant in the EDI office. Can't wait for this seminar to start. Thank you all for joining us. 42 participants, amazing. So I look forward to being here in this space with all of you.
Thanks, Desiree. Great. And Ayo, if you could share the screen as we go into our land and labor acknowledgement and community guidelines, I would appreciate it.
Oops, I did too fast.
Great. So as we all know, that UC Merced has a land and labor acknowledgement, which I will read. And this is a very deep time for us to reflect for both land and labor acknowledgement. And it reads, local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backwards, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century, and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane, and by day you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. And as our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, there is the addition acknowledgement that the lands and its first inhabitant, we must acknowledge that much of what we know in this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered from the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generation and resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. And throughout, as again, if you are joining us, the two questions that we always share with the group is, what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? And what is your organization doing beyond acknowledging whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in that space? So just keep having those two questions. And I think that will frame our time together. And again, also same thing for our community agreements, right? Just quickly, we agree to speak for ourselves and allow others to speak for themselves with no pressure to represent or explain to the whole group. We agree to listen with resilience, hanging in when something is hard to hear. And again, we will be monitoring the chat. Let us know in the chat or direct messages if you did not hear, or Ayo or folks who are speaking. We agree to consider asking questions to check out assumptions we are making rather than taking that assumption as fact. We agree to share airtime and participate within the suggested time frame. We have 90 minutes together and a follow-up debriefing after that. So we want to value your time. We agree to not interrupt except to indicate that we did not, we cannot or did not hear a speaker. We agree to pass or pass for now if we are not ready or willing to respond to a question. And we agree that when we discuss our experiences with people who are not present, we will not attach names or identifying information to participate comments unless we have permission to do so. So the whole concept of consent. We agree that this space is of learning, right? That no one, even the presenter, myself, right, is able to know all of the things, diversity, equity related. And again, we are all in the process of learning. Thank you, Ayo. So those are our community agreements. Again, it's foundational in terms of our time together for this and today and for the series. Okay, and now let me introduce you. I'm excited, right? Mind you, this is months in the making and conversation with Ayo. So again, Ayo, thank you so much. But Ayo Magwood is an educational consultant specializing in an in-depth evidence-based education on the history, economics, sociology, and cognitive physiology or psychology of structural racism. She also equips institutions with tools and strategies to foster more productive conversation about racism using her perspective consciousness approach. Her pro-equity model in K-12 instructional approach for teaching an inclusive and critical, honest curriculum that also fosters perspective consciousness, civic skill, dispositions, and a shared we identity. Ayo has over 10 years of classroom experiences in both majority, low-income, Black, Latino charter school and majority, high-income, white private schools. Ayo has a BA in economics and international relations from Brown University and Master of Science in Applied Economics from Cornell University. Ayo is the author of a book chapter, Why Elite Independent Schools Can't Retain Black and Brown Faculty, Anti-Oppressive Education in Elite Schools, Promising Practices, Cautionary Tales. Coming September 2021, were you available for pre-order?
Yes.
Thank you, Ayo. And a co-author of the article, Using Conceptual Tensions in Supreme Court Cases to Increase Critical Thinking in Government and Civics Classrooms and Social Education, volumes 77 in September 2013. Ayo's passion for anti-racist civics and social justice education and her lifelong quest to help people understand the perspective of others are informed by her personal identity and experiences as a cultural border crosser. She identifies as African-American and biracial, grew up in East Africa, West Africa, and Middle East, lived and worked in Mexico for 5 years and returns there every summer and speaks near fluent Spanish. Powerful and very skilled, talented. Her personal and parenting experiences with mental illness, dyslexia, and ADHD have also influenced her border crossing perspective on these issues. And again, Bobcat community, please give a warm of applause and that Bobcat love to Ayo Magwood.
Okay, shall I start now or?
Yep.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody. And I just want to point out, I don't have a PhD, but thank you for that. And this is just a few comments. So I'm not going to check the chat until the break, but feel free to use it to communicate with other participants and put any clarifying questions in the chat and someone will communicate them to me. I'm going to ask for 5 volunteers to read some slides with primary sources. I believe they are already identified, but if they do not speak up in a timely fashion, then perhaps somebody else could step in or you can volunteer somebody. And following the presentation, I'm just going to give you a heads up. Participants will be asked to share their reflections through the chat, okay? So this is the first in the series of 7. Today is on the origins, so the social construction of race, ethnicity, and racism. So today we're going to answer 2 essential questions. How and why were the races constructed? And how and why did anti-Black racism develop in the United States? So we're going to be focusing in on this area known as the Chesapeake area, mostly Virginia and North Carolina, somewhat South Carolina, because these were the colonies that existed during this time period. So the race and racism were first constructed in the mid 1600s, mid to late 1600s, early 1700s. So only the 13 colonies existed at that time, and these were also, and some, not even all those colonies existed, and also this is where enslavement was concentrated. So that's where my primary sources are going to be today. So our work, the seminar today is sort of divided up in two parts. That first part is that first question, how and why were race constructed, and also we'll look into ethnicity. And then that second part, which is much shorter, is how and why was racism developed, okay? And then after that, we'll discuss. So let's look at that first question first. We're going to look at race, racism, and slavery in the early colonial period. Okay, so before race was constructed, we need to see the before. So race and racism have not always existed. A lot of people assume we do, because the problem is that our history books and our US history books, oftentimes we sort of get parachuted in after race has already been constructed. So we sort of assume that it always existed. It seems so natural to us, like we can see it, right? We can see the different races. Of course they exist. Of course they're universal. Of course they've always existed, right? No, they actually haven't always existed. So during that, race relations, racism, and slavery were very different during the early colonial period, the first 50 to 100 years of our nation, before we were even a nation, than they were in the latter 150 years of slavery in the United States. And vast majority of history books don't cover this, so a lot of us just aren't aware that this occurred, that this was a thing. So race relations were very we're going to give I'm going to give you a little overview. We're going to look at it in much more detail. I'm just going to give you the cliff notes real quick. So during this period, relations were governed by class rather than race. Racism, the way we know it today, had not developed. Yes, bias existed, because bias, now that is universal. That has existed during the quote unquote caveman times, prehistoric times. But racism, the way we know it today, hadn't been developed yet. And slavery at this point was very different than how it was before. It was neither lifelong nor hereditary. In other words, chattel slavery hadn't yet developed. So chattel slavery is sort of like an extreme type of slavery that we developed here. So what I call old school slavery that was happening in other parts of the world, that was a little different. It wasn't necessarily lifelong, wasn't necessarily hereditary, it wasn't necessarily associated with one people. And also, in most cases, except for the historians believe the Middle East, the enslavement was, you still didn't lose your humanity. You were still a person. So with chattel slavery, the word chattel comes from the word cattle, the French word for cattle. It means that the enslaved person is no longer a human, that they're a thing, a cattle, livestock, real estate. And so that's what makes chattel slavery different from what I call old school slavery. And we developed that here in the in the Americas, but it didn't exist yet in this, and it hadn't been developed yet in this early period. And in fact, there weren't even a lot of enslaved people. 90% of the labor was through white indentured servants. And also interracial relationships and mixed race children were not uncommon, sort of like today. And they were growing communities of free African Americans. So very different. So I just want to be clarified. It's not that I'm contradicting what you know about race relations and racism and slavery, about history, but rather that, again, we usually don't talk about, this is usually not taught. This is before what you learned about, okay? So just a quick definition, wondering, because we're talking about indentured servants. So what's the difference between indentured servants and slavery? So if we think of a continuum with free labor on one end, that has to be completely free. And then unfree is this long continuum, and on the end would be completely unfree, slavery. So in between that area, that fuzzy area, that's what is considered forced, bonded, or coerced slavery. So indentured servants would fall in that area. So would quote unquote coolie labor, serfdom, corvée labor, debt peonage, prison labor, contract leasing. They're all not quite free, but not quite slavery either. Okay? So, and here we're going to see how in the beginning, you can see 1640, 1660, right? There's mostly indentured servants. And you see that transition by the 1700s, they've been replaced by enslaved labor. That's going to be important to our story today. And here we can see in the Chesapeake colonies, the population, white is blue, and the black population, the red population, you can see there's not that many black people, right? When we're looking at this early colonial period, not that many black people. And you can see the Native Americans we wipe them out. That is why they do not feature in our story today, because by the time we create race, we construct race, they've pretty much been wiped out. So they die, we kill them off with diseases and war, and also we push them off the land. Some get sold to the Caribbean. And so race is constructed in the United States only from white and black, which is in comparison to other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, where race was constructed with white, black, and Native American. So before we look at the primary sources, I'm gonna give a little bit of background because it's been a long time for most of you since our US history classes. So first of all, who were those indentured servants? Because I said 90% of the labor was supplied by these European indentured servants, where they were usually English or Irish, sometimes German, other places, but usually English, Irish, dirt poor, very young, and they had 4 to 7 year contracts. And the idea was that if they came and served those 4 to 7 years completely free, they didn't get paid anything during that time. They got paid their ship passage. And then at the end of the 47 years, if they survived, of course, then they got their freedom dues. And the freedom dues consisted of land, which was huge. They could be masters of their own land. You have to understand that during this time, England and Ireland were going through the enclosure movement, which is before the enclosure movement, the peasants could often use the land of the local landowner. He had so much land, he had land like extra land left over. They could use that to grow their crops and survive. During the enclosure movement, the price of wool shot up. And so all the landlords enclosed their lands with fences so that they could grow sheep and raise sheep. And that meant that the peasants no longer had access to land. And so they were starving to death. They were walking through the streets. They went to the nearest cities where they were just literally starving in the streets. The prisons were bursting. The poorhouses were bursting. So this was a viable alternative. Go to the Americas and work for 4 to 7 years, get paid nothing. But at the end of that, you get to be master of your own land. So this was huge. Their lives were nasty, brutish, and short, and they were treated very similar to enslaved labor, almost identical. This does not mean that they were enslaved. There was a difference, there was a bright line between indentured and enslaved. They were both free, they were both treated horribly, but legally, there's a big difference between indentured and enslaved, as we're going to see. And you have to understand that the horrible thing about slavery isn't that you were working all day very underneath the hot sun and you got treated horribly. That is not the horrible thing about slavery. Remember, slavery means that you have zero humanity. Especially with chattel slavery, you have no agency. Your family can be raped and tortured and sold away from you right in front of you, and you can't say anything. So let's just keep that clear. But they did live, work, and socialize very closely with enslaved labor, with enslaved Blacks who were 10% of labor. And now we have an idea where some of those mixed race babies were being born, right? And also the other thing to know is that the reason why they started off mostly with indentured servants is because they were more profitable than slavery during this time, because only about 40% of them survived. So remember with indentured servants, you're paying them after the 4 to 7 year contract. So that means the 60% that died, yeah, you never have to pay those freedom dues. You only have to pay the ship passage. Whereas with slave labor, you have to pay that entire price up front, okay? And the reason why only 40% of them were survived is, you might remember from your US history class about how infected the the Native Americans with smallpox, their immune systems weren't used to smallpox, and so we decimated them with the disease. Well, it worked both ways. So the Europeans weren't used to the germs and diseases that were on the Americas. So they, in this initial period, they also died. They were also decimated, essentially. And then the other thing you need to know before you look at the primary sources is about the importance of land. So land was the end all and the be all. It determined your economic prosperity. It's not exactly like you can't get a job as a manager in Silicon Valley or in CVS or a factory, right? The most ways you could make your money involved land. Also, political rights were determined by land ownership. You want to vote? You need to be a landowner. And so therefore, land also determined your social status. And so that's why it was so big. Okay, so now we're going to look at the primary sources. So we got to remember that, so a primary source is, we can think of it as a witness of a crime. A primary source is somebody who has directly experienced or witnessed a historical event or development. And it's their own words, as opposed to a secondary source would be a history book, a historian, and me. Okay, so we're going to look at that. And history is not a list of books and a list of facts in the textbook. It's that mess of all those different contrasting and sometimes conflicting perspectives of those primary sources. So we're going to be like detectives looking at clues. How did Blacks and whites of the same class seem to get along based on these primary sources? What did a person's social status and wealth depend on? And more in general, what conclusions do you draw? What patterns do you see? What surprises you? So I'm going to read the first one, and then hopefully 5 other people will read the others. So this is a runaway ad, Virginia Gazette, February 21st, 1771. 25 pounds reward. Runaway from the planter in Cumberland County, Virginia, the 3rd of June last, a Virginia-born Negro man slave named Will. Nota bene, George Kelly, an Irishman, had some dealings with the above slave before he ran away, and I have reason to think harbored him sometime after. Kelly ran away in August and crossed the Roanoke River at Jefferson's Ferry. It is probable the slave had some place appointed to meet him in Carolina, and if they are together, I have no doubt will endeavor to make him pass for a free man. So just to clarify, the planter wants both the white indentured servant and the Black enslaved men back. This wanted ad is for both of them. They knew each other from the same plantation. And they've run away at different times, but the planter is convinced that it was coordinated and that this white man is going to help him pass. Gives us an idea of the relations between indentured servants and enslaved people at the time. This is 1771. Okay, could somebody read the second one?
A runaway ad, Virginia Gazette, July 9th, 1772. Runaway from the planter in King and Queen County. About a fortnight ago, a Negro went about 21 years of age. She is tall and black and supposed to be pretty far gone with child. At the same time went away an indented servant man named James Bruce, a seaman from Scotland. It is supposed the servant man carried her away.
Thank you. I think we have a pretty good idea who the father of the unborn child is, right? So this is, again, another runaway ad for both a white indentured servant and an enslaved Black person, also showing relations between the two. Now, in addition to the reason that the men ran away, they possibly had an additional reason. So by 1772, the laws had changed, the legal doctrine had changed. Remember I told you there was a bright line between enslaved and free. So indentured counted as free. So before this time, then your legal status was inherited from the father. So if you're free, your father's free, you're free. If your father's enslaved, you're enslaved. So that by 1772, that had switched. And so your legal status was inherited from the mother. So if they had stayed, the child would have been born permanently enslaved. That would have been another incentive for them to run away. Okay, get another person.
Christian Finney, a white indentured servant woman, had her contract extended by a year and her child bound indentured for 31 years by order of the 7 December 1736 Carteret County, North Carolina court because she had a mulatto bastard child during her service. She was likely the common law wife of an enslaved Black man because she was charged with having another mulatto child born 10 July 1739 and another on 20 December 1743.
Thank you. So as always, low-income women face the brunt of societal bigotry and biases, right? So this is an enslaved servant woman, and she's brought into the county court because she has a child that's both bastard and mulatto. So all children of indentured servants were automatically quote unquote bastard or illegal because both indentured servants, like enslaved people, were not allowed to get married or have children. So the planters were concerned that, first of all, a pregnant or nursing mother would not be a very productive worker. And second of all, they were concerned about that the child being a burden on them. And the courts were concerned that the child would be a burden on the county. Remember, the indentured servants have zero income, so they cannot support the child. So regardless of the race of the child, the planter would bring in the indentured servant to court, and they would extend the contract of the mother to compensate for the reduced productivity of the mother. Plus, they would bind out the child to compensate for the cost of the child. But by this time, they were starting to try to crack down on all these mixed race babies being born. And so so the fine was greater and the indentureship of the child was longer. So 31 years is basically the productive life of a poor person at this time. So it's extreme. But so this was horrible for these families, but it's great for historians because that means that they have to note that the child is mixed race or mulatto in order to justify the greater fees and the longer internship. And so now we have almost perfect records of all the mixed race children being born to, at least the ones being born to indentured servant women during the colonial period. And we know she had to have been, the three children couldn't have been from different men. It was probable that it was from the same man, which means that this is a family. This is a common law family who was trying, and you see how, because of their relationship, her contract her indentureship keeps getting extended and extended and extended. And in fact, this is the ancestry of all the traceable free Black families in Colonial, North Carolina, and Virginia. So over 90% of them, and you can see the majority of them are mixed race children are born to white servant women. Well, these are the free Black families. This does not count any mixed race children being born to enslaved Black women. Unfortunately, don't have any documentation of that. But we do have documentation of over 1,000 mixed race children born to white women in Colonial, North Carolina, and Virginia. That is a lot, considering that there weren't that many people at that point in time. So that's a considerable number. Okay, let's go on to the fourth source. Can I get a volunteer?
In 1653, a Northampton County, Virginia court officer reported that when he presented Anthony Longo, Negro, with a summons, Longo had chased him away. "What shall I go to court for? Go about your business, you idle rascal. Shit of your warrant, have I nothing to do but go to court?" The officer complained that Anthony continued to call him an idle rascal, as did likewise his wife, with such noise that I could hardly hear my own words. And when I had done reading the warrant, he struck at me and gave me some blows. Anthony's wife was white.
So here we are, 1653. This African-American is free, and he is married to a white woman, and he apparently feels comfortable enough in the local racial hierarchy that he could tell the white court officer what to do, what to do when he got there, to go away. So, and I have a lot of African-American men who say, I couldn't get away with this today. The police would be called, right? So this is quite remarkable. One more.
Race relations were particularly fluid and friendly in less densely populated frontier areas where whites welcomed new neighbors regardless of race. when the North Carolina legislature passed discriminatory tax laws against free African-American families, white residents of Granville, Halifax, and Northampton counties petitioned for the law's repeal in 1762, describing their free Negro and mulatto neighbors as persons of probity and good demeanor who cheerfully contribute towards the discharge of every public duty enjoined them.
Thank you. So as we're going to see, racism develops in places that are more densely populated and where slavery starts to become more important to the economy. So the way humans work is when we are in a smaller group, like let's say less than 150 is what economists and sociologists are finding. And especially where we're in a situation where we're fighting for survival, right? We're worried about bears and surviving and enemy Native Americans. Then the us versus them, us is all of us in the community. And them is outsiders, that threat from the outside. But as we start to grow, and as we become more densely populated, and then that's when we start dividing up. That's when we start seeing us versus them within the community, and we start differentiating for race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, et cetera. So that's why you see in the frontier areas, you'll see much more flexibility and less racism. Of course, this is a temporary situation, because this was at the frontier in 1762. North Carolina was the frontier, because of course the Americas started in Virginia, right? So after at some point that becomes more densely populated, and then South Carolina becomes the frontier, and then Georgia, and then the Midwest, and then California, right? So we're going to see that African Americans sort of keep on moving out to the frontier to try to escape from some of the racism. But during this period, at least, we're also going to see that California for a while also had this frontier area. So later on in the Latin American seminar, we're going to see how whites, blacks, and Mexicans and Native Americans all mixed in much more freely before they became densely populated, so the similar type of thing. Okay, now we have that the last source, primary source.
In 1731, some members of the free mulatto Gibson family moved to Virginia to South Carolina. A member of the Commons House of Assembly complained that several free colored men with their white wives have immigrated from Virginia. Governor Robert Johnson of South Carolina summoned Gideon Gibson and his family to explain their presence there. After meeting Gibson and his family, the governor reported, "I've had them before me in council, and upon examination find that they are not Negroes nor slaves, but free people. That the father of them here is named Gideon Gibson, and his father was also free. I have been informed by a person who has lived in Virginia that this Gibson has lived there several years in good repute, and by his papers that he has produced before me, that the transactions there have been very regular. That he has for several years paid taxes for 2 tracts of land and had several Negroes of his own, that he is a carpenter by trade and is come hither for the support of his family."
Thank you. So just to clarify, when he says that they're not Negroes, he means they're not enslaved. So the vocabulary and the concepts were still developing at this time. And so Negro was often used as a synonym for enslaved. It does not have to do with him being light-skinned. So here we have the Gibson family. So they're free African Americans descended from a union between white indentured servant woman and an enslaved man. So they have been free for 3 generations. And you notice that they're moving from Virginia to South Carolina. That is not a coincidence. So basically they're moving out to the frontier to escape growing racism in Virginia, which has become more densely populated. So they're moving out to South Carolina, which is frontier. And sure enough, you can see that the governor, initially they have some concerns, right? Oh, who are these free colored men with their white wives? But as soon as, what does he look for? He is looking for money and economics, and he's paying his dues. Oh, he's fine then. Then they don't care. They no longer care about his race. This is typical of the frontier. We also see that they own enslaved people, right? And they're Black. So I remember when I told you that it wasn't a racist society, that didn't mean that this was a idyllic, wonderful place. It was really cruel and oppressive and exploitative, but just based on class rather than on race. So they have a very class-based society. So rich people, whether they're white or Black or Native American, they consider themselves almost a different species. Like this was their wealth was given by God, and they were supposed to be wealthy, and they looked upon poor people, whether they were white or Black, as almost a different species and as deserving of their stature. So so yes, all wealthy Blacks at that time, there weren't that many. We're talking about maybe 2 dozen. Okay, so we're talking about 2 dozen families in the Americas who were wealthy landowners. But they went to church with whites. They, as you can see, intermarried with whites, and they did business with whites, and socialized with whites, other wealthy whites, and they owned both white indentured servants. Well, the Gibson family didn't have at this point in time. It could have been because they were traveling, but many of their peers do. They owned both indentured white servants and enslaved Black people, because that's what rich people did at the time, right? And so you can see that those mixed race children are being born within the classes. So wealthy Blacks and wealthy whites are intermarrying, and poor Blacks and poor whites are intermarrying. So you will see sometimes the conservative memes saying, oh, well, slavery is okay because Black people own slaves. Well, first of all, and they usually say hundreds and thousands of Black people own slaves. First of all, we're talking maybe 2 dozen families. But also, I mean, slavery is slavery. It's 2 wrongs don't make a right. And also, a final note is that this was before slavery was chattel slavery. This was in the early days where many of these enslaved people, we trace them through the tax records, and they're free later on. Okay, so what can we see through that, through those primary sources? How did Blacks and whites of the same class get along? What did a person's social status and wealth depend on? And in general, what conclusions do you draw? What patterns do you see? What surprises you? I don't want to wait too long, but I would love if everybody could just quickly put on their chat some of their thoughts, and we can we're going to just so we can read everyone's responses. And if you have a quick question at this time, I'll also take it.
And again, please put something in the chat. Oh, there you go. So Io, we have Cynthia that shared the insight and conversation of moving.
Okay, I was waiting for others. I guess everyone else isn't. I'll just continue then, if that's okay. If no one else is going to.
Oh. Hold on, Io, there's another one. Okay. Social status and wealth.
Status and wealth dependent on land. Yep.
Oh, here, they're coming in.
Should I read them?
Yep.
Social status by God. It is surprising, but also not a shocker that it was a point about class rather than race. Seemed like Blacks and whites got along just fine as long as they were the same class. Importance of race versus class. They got along just fine. Land association by economic status. Surprised by the 2 dozen wealthy Black families owning Black slaves. Seemed like Black and white people lived together, divided by class, not by race, and as equals class system. Okay, great. So I'm gonna go on. So I'm sure you are wondering what happened, right? Why did things change? Because obviously they changed a lot, right? Historians call it the Great Transformation. So what changed was that indentured servants started surviving their contracts. Remember, the whole reason why they were preferable to enslaved people is because they were cheaper And the reason why they were cheaper is because you didn't pay that freedom dues up front. That was the big payment, the freedom dues. You paid that at the end of the contract. And remember, 60% of them died before they finished their contract. Sometimes a lot of them, in fact, didn't even survive the first winter. And so they would just die and then they would just get a new one. So they were cheaper than enslaved people who you could buy, who you needed to purchase the entire payment up front. So what happened was, after a while, their immune systems got used to the local diseases, right? And so they started, and so they started surviving, and that servant labor was less profitable relatively compared to enslaved labor, because they had to pay the servants their freedom dues. And also there was a growing threat of rebellion from poor whites and poor blacks united, because there was increasing numbers of angry, landless, poor white people, men with guns, because that was part of their freedom dues. And the freedom dues, they got besides the land, they got some seeds, some corn to last them to the next harvest, and some clothes and some farming utensils and guns for defense and hunting purposes. So all of them had guns as part of their freedom dues, and they were friendly with poor black people. Doesn't sound good for the planters, right? And also historians point out that the supply of indentured servants from England and Ireland started to dry up around this time because they got over that depression, recession they were coming over. Economic situation was looking up. Plus, word was starting to get back to England and Ireland that this indentured servant thing was not the best deal after all. So it looks sort of like this. In the early 1600s, there's your wealthy landowning planters, and you only have a few poor landless whites, because again, most of them don't survive, right? And then you have only a few black people. But by the mid 1600s, the countryside starts to look like this. So the wealthy landowner planters, they're not reproducing, they're not growing as fast. But these poor landless whites are, because remember, the indentureship contract is only for 4 to 7 years. So that means every 4 to 7 years, the poor landless white population is at least doubling, right? Every 4 to 7 years. So they're growing much faster. And so the numbers start, and they're working in unison together, this starts to get dangerous. And so there's a series of class-based rebellions between poor whites and poor blacks. Most of them don't make it in the history books. Most of them don't even get a name, but one of them did. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 makes it into the history books. So you can see in this painting, so in the middle person, you see he's dressed quite well. He's actually a gentleman. So that is Bacon. And he's actually the cousin of the governor. He's a wealthy, comes over, and he's fighting for selfish reasons because he didn't get what he wanted, and the governor's policies are ruining his business. So he's able to very easily rile up all the poor people. Look at their clothes. You can see everybody else is poor, right? And look at the face of the drummer. He is not white. He's either black or mixed race. And you notice they all have their guns, right? So they don't end up killing any white people. Unfortunately, they end up massacring a Native American, because it's a complicated story that also involved relations or conflict with Native Americans nearby. But the elite whites were threatened not just because of the conflict, but directly they saw this rebellion as a class conflict. They didn't actually kill any whites, but they did burn down Jamestown completely. And this is symbolically, this is huge. Jamestown is where the Americas started. It was the capital of not just of Virginia, but the entire geographic region. This is the center, the government seat, the center of industry, the economy, of slavery, right? And this is where the rich people have their townhouses and the stores. So this is huge. The governor has to go all the way first of all, has to call for troops from England to put down the rebellion. And also the king is so angry that he demands that the governor come in and explain himself back in England, in London. So it was a huge deal. And historians believe that this triggered the Great Transformation, because the wealthy realized that this situation was unstable, socially unstable, and the terrible transformation. So the terrible transformation was the transformation from the change from the use of indentured servitude to the use of chattel slavery. So notice this is not just a change in the demographic group from poor whites to poor blacks, but it's also a change in the economic or labor from servitude. And this is also where slavery becomes ramped up from old school slavery to chattel slavery. This is where slavery becomes race-based, lifelong, inheritable, and where the enslaved person loses their humanity, is no longer a person, becomes chattel, cattle, real estate, property. But this requires, in order to do that, this involves a shift from a class-based society to a race-based society where all enslaved people, all the people on the bottom are Black and all the people on the top are white. But before you do that, you really have to construct races because as you could see beforehand, the races didn't really, at least, they didn't have that very clear binary of Black and white. You could see the shifting and the blurred lines within the races. So this is the shift from the indentured servitude to chattel slavery required all of these things. I want to emphasize this did not happen from one day to the other. This was a process, and it was like sort of brick by brick, and it happened over 50 to 70 years, and it was not controlled by one person or on top. It's sort of like the New York City has the most segregated public school system in the entire country, and all of the best public schools are monopolized by wealthy white families. But it's not that like somebody has maneuvered and is controlling this. It's tens and thousands of white families who have disproportionate wealth and contacts and power who are individually making decisions and pushing for policies that benefit them. This is the same sort of thing. It's many whites who are wealthy whites who are pushing for the policies that benefit them. So we can see the shift here. Remember this population? So this is 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. And sure enough, you can see the Black population, the red line, increasing dramatically after this. Right? We see a transition from the early colonial period. We really had a class-based hierarchy where wealthy whites and wealthy Blacks did business together, intermarried, socialized together, and went to church together. And then on the bottom, you saw white indentured servants and enslaved Blacks, as well as the post-indentured whites who were also in the same class. Versus by the late colonial period, you really have a much more familiar race-based society with all the white people at the top, all the Black people at the bottom, and very conveniently, you see that racial divide between poor whites and poor Blacks. Divide and conquer, no more Bacon's Rebellion. So this is where we're going to go into how race was constructed. So this is probably the longest section. So race is not biological, it's a social construct. You may have heard this, but we're going to break this down and look at what this really means. Specifically, it's a legal construct. It was constructed through laws, as we're going to see. We're not going to talk about racism yet until that last section, but I just want to very quickly mention that just because race is a social construct doesn't make racism any less real. So, for example, money is a social construct, right? It doesn't exist in nature, but we agree on it. We agree on that these coins have a value. And that we're going to exchange them. But just because money is a social construct, but just because it's a social construct, that doesn't mean we throw it away, right? It has very real consequences after we agree to it. Or laws are a social construct. We agree, but you can't like touch them or feel them, right? It's rules that we have agreed to abide by and have, but they have very real consequences. We can't just ignore them. So race is the same way. It's a social construct, but that doesn't make it any less real, okay? So race, racism, and chattel slavery were legally constructed through laws and codes between 1670s and 1850s. It was really a brick by brick situation. So this is the first. I'm going to show you the overview. There were sort of 5 buckets, and then in the next slide I'll show you specific laws. So 4 buckets. So one bucket of laws was the slave code. This institutionalized chattel slavery. Okay. Then the second bucket of laws stripped rights away from free Blacks. John Hope Franklin, the historian John Hope Franklin referred to them as the Free Negro Code. A third bucket of laws prohibited interracial marriage and deterred the birth of mixed race children. So you notice that the second and third bucket of laws, they came out of that first bucket of laws, because it's very hard to get away with saying, okay, all Blacks are going to be enslaved and all Blacks are inferior and all whites are superior. It's very hard to get away with that when there's all these mixed race relationships and interracial children and prosperous free Blacks running around. So it's very hard to claim that binary. So you have to get rid of all those people in that binary. All those people don't fit that stereotype. You need to get rid of them. So that's why you have bucket 2 and bucket 3. They're really going for that binary. And then finally, the fourth bucket of laws extended rights to poor whites on the basis of race versus land ownership, because before they were based on land ownership and now they're based on race. So that's why they call them freeborn rights. Freeborn meant you were freeborn white. So this is basically the first white privilege. So let's look at some of these specific laws. So I'm going to stick to Virginia. So each colony created their own laws on race and racism, but you can think of Virginia was the original. I do have to mention that they were influenced by Barbados, by many of the laws, but they were the first ones in the colonies to create laws on race and racism. And from there, many of the other colonies, as they became more densely populated and as the importance of slavery grew, they in turn adopted their own laws, similar laws on race and racism, but essentially mostly they were copy pasted with a little bit of variation from Virginia. And the second reason I'm going to stick to Virginia, besides being the first, is so that we can appreciate the chronology. Okay, because remember the other ones were adopting them later. There was a time lag, so we wouldn't be able to appreciate the chronology. So 1619, all familiar with, 20 and odd Negroes, first Africans arrive in Jamestown. 1640, Virginia sentences a Black indentured servant runaway, because most of those, I apologize, I should have mentioned, historians are unsure, but they suspect that a lot of them were actually indentured rather than enslaved, because they were baptized on the ship. So the Portuguese baptized them on the ship. And at that time, the colonists were still abiding by religious practices, Christian doctrine, saying that you can't enslave a fellow baptized Christian. It's the same thing in all three of the religions of the book. Jews, Muslims and Christians all have religious traditions that you can't enslave your own, someone who's a fellow baptized person of your religion. So because they had been baptized, they couldn't be enslaved. So historians believe that they were all indentured servants. In 1640, Virginia sentences a Black indentured servant runaway, John Punch, who, by the way, is a distant ancestor of former President Obama's white mother, with servitude for natural life. This is the first documented enslaved person for life, because again, in that early period, enslavement didn't differ that much from indenture. It was the old school slavery. So this is a step towards chattel slavery. In 1662, Virginia changes English legal doctrine so that the legal status of children is determined by the mother instead of the father. Remember, we saw that with, that's when we suspect maybe that's one of the reasons why that couple ran away, that mixed race, interracial couple ran away. But the reason why they did this is because this makes slavery hereditary, and this grows their stock of enslaved persons. But again, this is another step towards chattel slavery. So first you make it for lifelong, and then you make it hereditary. In 1667, Virginia declares that baptized Blacks can still be kept enslaved. So now, not only are they, not only does the class doesn't matter, but also religion doesn't. The race also trumps not just class, but also trumps religion. And they argued that two things. They argued that, first of all, it doesn't count when they're baptized Blacks. They said they have to be born Christian for them to be not enslaved. And then the other reason they argued, they said, this way we can save their souls. So, and that's more important than enslavement. So this way, this allows us to save their souls. That was the justification they used. 1670, Virginia forbids free blacks from owning white servants. You can see from class from class society to a race society. And by the way, also what's intriguing about these laws is that no legislator is going to pass a law, because of the cost and the time. They're not going to go through all that trouble unless this was behavior that was actually happening. So by forbidding free blacks from owning white servants, it suggests that it confirms that free blacks owned white servants. It tells us a lot about that early period, just like those primary sources told us a lot about that early period. 1691, Virginia prohibits interracial marriages and the freeing of slaves. Of course, it would become until 1968 until Loving v. Virginia switches that. And this is, by the way, this law was the first documented reference to a white race in Virginia. Notice they mentioned the word Negro, but you did not see the word white, because they distinguish between English and Irish and German. They did not see themselves as a white race. This was not until 1691. And by the way, remember I told you that Virginia was always the first to do everything with race and racism and slavery? This is the one time they got beat. Maryland has a legal reference to a white race in 1681. In 1705, Virginia passes a law barring any Negro or mulatto from holding office. Again, tells us something about that pre-racism period. And in 1705, Virginia slave law codifies all slaves shall be held to be real estate. This is chattel slavery. And so here you can see, there's one more. In 1723, Virginia strips rights from free blacks, including the right to vote and carry a gun. So you can really see here brick by brick, and notice I've on the left column, you can see the dates, how this wasn't from one day to the other, but you notice that each change basically allows the next change, right? And so over time, I didn't put in the first two into red because that was sort of before period. So the white and black races were socially constructed through laws, right? We can see that. So during the early colonial period, we can think of the white, Negro, or mulatto as somewhat fluid racial categories that are subordinate to class status and also to religion, right? And we can think of it as a spectrum with all whites on one end, blacks on the other end, in between a growing number of mixed race people. By the late colonial period, white and Negro are seen as distinct, essentialized, natural, God-given binary categories. And you can think of this red line around it as the laws, right? There's laws that decide who's black and who's white. There's laws that define the races and that give rights and define what rights and freedoms the white and the black race have, right? We love to put things into boxes. We do the same thing with gender and sexuality, right? We force them into boxes. And oftentimes we have laws to define them and to police the races, right? And these physical differences between the races are biological, but the boxes we group them in, what we consider white or black or Latino or Asian, and the characteristics we ascribe to them and the relative status we rank them by, clearly, those are socially constructed. It's just like you can think of, again, remember I mentioned money, right? The different coins and the different bills are physically different, but the value we ascribe to them is socially constructed. So since races are social constructs rather than biologically determined, then the defined boundaries of race, like we saw in that picture, are change across time and history. They're dynamic rather than static. And also they differ across societies. They're culturally specific rather than universal. That's what we're going to look at next. First, we're going to look at how they change over time or history. So US definitions of race have changed many times. Even during the colonial times, they're black and white. So in 1705, we had 3 races, mulatto being 1/8 black. In 1785, mulatto changed to 1/4 black. In 1868, mulatto disappeared. We went back to 2 races. We went to 2 races, and with black being defined as 1/16 black. 1924, we went to the 1 drop law of rule, where if you had 1 drop of black blood, you were considered black, or at least Negro. And they also have, after we started growing, then they had to figure out how everybody else fit into those 2 categories. So during our time of colonization in the late 1880s, we had to decide whether Filipinos, Hawaiians, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans were white or black. Because if they were white, we couldn't colonize them. If we were black, then we could colonize them. Conveniently, we decided they were black. During the 1790 Naturalization Act, which limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons, all of a sudden, a lot of people wanted to be categorized as white. Armenians won. They won their case and they became white. The Japanese and Asian Indians lost their cases and they were ruled not white. Italians, Irish, and Jews sometimes were considered white, but not clearly, at least not socially, until the 1950s. Well, it was actually a 1-2 of World War II, plus they benefited from federal housing programs and subsidies that were given only to whites, and they mixed in the suburbs with other whites, and most sociologists conclude that Italians, Irish, and Jews became white during this period. So you can see the changes. And this whole idea of constructing identities based on phenotype, skin color, the facial figures, a physical type, that's a new thing. That was started, we didn't know about that until the Enlightenment Europe. So before Enlightenment, late 1600s, early 1700s, so identities around the world, they were still socially constructed. All identities are socially constructed, let's make that clear, but they just weren't constructed on phenotype, physical phenotype, skin color, or at least not generally. Generally, most before the 1600s, the social identities were based on ethnicity, meaning cultural heritage, language, religion, kinship. It did not occur to anybody to define identities based on physical features until the Enlightenment period. And that was through that, that was through Darwin and the origins of the species. And so he was, they were categorizing plants and animals, and so they went from there to people. And these Enlightenment ideas of the racial superiority of European whites and the racial inferiority of all non-whites were also very conveniently justified imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, which of course happened during that time. But then those ideas of race then spread around the world, or at least Europeans spread them around the world. So for example, pre-Enlightenment, the Romans and the barbarians thought they had nothing, the Romans thought they had absolutely nothing in common with the barbarians, right? During King Philip's War or many Native American conflicts, oftentimes Native American nations sometimes would ally with the English against other Native American nations because they had nothing in common. They didn't feel like they had anything. They did not see any similarity or affinity with each other. So they based it based on political, they were just political allies. During the Atlantic slave trade, you often see, well, the Africans enslaved each other and they sold their people to the white slave traders. The concept of Black, the concept of African did not exist at that time. So it's the same thing as with the Native Americans. They would just, it was just an allyship, and these were enemy tribes in the enemy kingdoms. And so they would sell captives and prisoners from enemy kingdoms to the enslaved people. And then of course in Asia, just to give one example, the Korean Japanese certainly didn't think of themselves as in the same identity, right? If you know that history. This is pre-Enlightenment, but by post-Enlightenment, then all these people are considered white, all these people are considered Native American, all these people are considered Black, and all these people are considered Asian. So you see the construction of race, and this post-Enlightenment. And since race is our social construct, we can also see that they differ across society. They're culturally specific rather than universal. I'll give you some examples of that. So yes, again, just like the coins, physical differences are clearly biological, right? That we can see them. However, it's those boxes that we group them in that are socially constructed. There's a difference between skin color or nose shape and a race, right? So how do we group these physical differences? For example, skin color. Do we group them like, whoops, do we group them like that? Or do we group them like that? Clearly it's arbitrary, right? It clearly depends on the political and cultural and demographic situation in each country. And we see different, you can pretty much divide among the different countries, countries that have racial binaries from countries that have racial spectrums in the Americas. So racial binaries are countries in which that have basically just white or black. They may have a small group, a leftover group in the middle, but basically the country is divided into white and black. So clear binaries are United States and Canada, but other countries that have this racial binary are South Africa, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Southern Brazil. In these countries, and there's a pattern. All of these countries had historical ideologies of whiteness, and they had state policies of white domination. So there was a benefit of being white, versus other countries have racial spectrums. So for example, Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, and Northern Brazil. In these countries, it's not really a race, it's more about skin color. And these are countries that had historical ideologies of mestizaje, or in Brazil's case, racial democracy. So in this case, in these places, it's an advantage to be mestizo or pardo. And so most people are identified as mestizo pardo, whereas in countries where white was historically recognized, you see that binary. So what's interesting is the same skin color that's considered white in some countries can be considered not white in another country. And the same exact skin color that can be considered black in one country is not black in another country, because the social constructions are different because of different historical policies and developments. So these are the countries, in countries where you have race, those are nations with histories of official racial classifications and state-sanctioned racial discrimination. Whereas in these countries, you do have discrimination, but it's not racism. It's bias or prejudice based on skin color. It's horrible too, but it's slightly different. It's like saying oranges and mandarins, right? Slightly different. And these are nations with histories of official ideologies of mestizaje or racial democracy. Here's another example of a construction of race. There's all these are Asian American communities in the United States, in thousands, or hundreds of thousands. So, I'm sorry, thousands. The idea of a Asian American race was thought of politically. It was a political idea by different Asian American activists who were trying to organize Asian Americans to fight together to advocate together for different policies. But at least in my particular case, a lot of my friends, Asian American friends, up until 2 years ago, they identified primarily as Korean American or Vietnamese American. And what I noticed is over the last year, increasing numbers of them are now identifying first as Asian American and secondly as Korean American or Vietnamese American or Philippine American, or whatever it is. And I think we know why, right? It's because of that increase in Asian American, anti-Asian American violence, which is forging this identity. So in other words, this anti-Black racism and rigid consequential caste-like racial categories and identities are both byproducts of national ideologies, white normativity, and nationalism that need to unify competing white groups. But then, but once constructed, these state-sanctioned race and racism do not quickly fade, even once the laws are struck down. So for whites in South Africa and the United States benefited from defining themselves as white, with the state defining racism and varying forms of segregation. But this is the key. Once race has been so constructed, even in long time ago in history, that state cannot easily dismantle its awful creation. Social structure, types, and attitudes are coins that do not readily melt. Once they are formed, they persist. Racial identities ingrained through personal painful experience and embedded in everyday life do not quickly fade, even if the conditions that reinforce them change. So you can see that. And then if you don't have that, these racial then you have something different. So this is a quote from an unnamed unnamed Nigerian born playwright that's quoted in Isabel Wickerson's book, Caste. So she said, "You know, there are no Black people in Africa. Africans are not Black. They're Igbo and Yoruba, Iwe, Akan, and Ndebele. They don't become Black until they come to America or come to the UK." And it's the same thing, again, Asian, Korean Americans and Vietnamese Americans and Filipino Americans, often they don't consider themselves Asian until they come to the United States and are faced with anti-Asian violence. In other words, whiteness is a constantly shifting boundary separating those who are entitled to have certain privileges from those whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified by their not being white. In other words, races are categories of privilege. And every country and society has their own categories of privilege. Race just happens to be the one that we have. But dominant groups in all societies will take advantage of some kind of physical or cultural and social difference, and they'll use that to create a hierarchy. And that's what race is an example of that. So this, I've finished the first part, which is 2/3 or 3/4 of the seminar. It's the biggest one. I'm going to summarize. Remember, we had 2 essential questions, and one of them was, how were the races constructed? So here's a summary. America was originally a class-based society. Black and white people of the same class generally got along. Colonial America was home to a prosperous community of free Blacks. A few were wealthy slave owners who voted and held office. Interracial marriages and biracial children were not uncommon. Colonial elites faced several multiracial class rebellions. Race is a social construct. The United States Black-white binary is arbitrary and unique to our nation. Races are examples of categories of privilege. Dominant groups in all societies construct categories of privilege based on some perceived societal difference: race, ethnicity, religion, language, caste, we can go on, right? So the last 2 parts are the shortest part. I usually stop for a minute, but I noticed that there was no questions or comments, so I'm just gonna forge on. So how, I think we have a pretty good idea, but we're gonna look at how this ended up with racism being developed. So you may have heard people say that racism is prejudice plus power. What does that mean anyhow? So prejudice is negative bias. Bias can be both positive and negative. So prejudice is negative bias. Bias, what we could think of as intergroup bias consists of in-group favoritism. It's like in-group love, or bias against outgroups. We also call that outgroup hate. And everybody has them because they're vestigial tendencies that evolved during prehistoric times. During prehistoric times, it was very convenient to have those biases, and those who had them were more likely to survive and pass them on through their genes. And so right now, they're not very useful to have. In fact, they're counterproductive. However, we're stuck with them. They're vestigial, left over like the appendix. Remember, the appendix used to be helpful at some point. We don't need it anymore, but we're still stuck with it. That means it's vestigial. So we all have biases, but you notice that it's not predetermined who the in-groups are and who the out-groups are. And also the particular stereotypes that we have with different groups is also not preordained, right? We just have that tendency. So how does it get from that to racism? Well, structural inequity is, and you notice here, I didn't say structural racism. So I'm speaking more generally now, including racism, but this is a more general pattern. Structural inequities in general, so structural poverty, structural homophobia, structural sexism, etc., are societal biases that have been intensified, codified, meaning put into law, and weaponized to protect and rationalize the interests of dominant groups or elites. We can think of it as a tidal wave. So the waves on the bottom, the little waves on the bottom, we can think of those as the individual biases. And you notice that some people have more bias, some people have less bias, and they're not organized. They're all over the place. Different people have biases against different people, different groups. And also, if you're swimming in the ocean and get hit by a bias, it hurts, it stings, but it's not going to take you out. Versus the tidal wave, which is structural inequity, like structural racism. And that's the racism is that prejudice, that bias, plus that power, right? It's that power, those laws. So for example, those anti-Black, we saw in that those anti-Black biases weren't that strong and they were disorganized and some people didn't even have any. But then when the government added those laws, and that's when they created racism as we know it today. And that's why we can see in countries like Mexico that had mestizaje, they never had those laws. They only have the biases. They have the biases, but they don't have that history and those laws to make it a tidal wave. And that's why we distinguish between biases and structural inequity. Yet another example of this is the Nazis whipped up, they intensified, codified, and weaponized anti-Semitic bias. They added the laws, Nuremberg laws, and the concentration camps. They created that tidal wave. And if you look, you'll see that pattern all over. You'll see that pattern repeated again and again in different societies and in different chapters in history, because it's a very powerful weapon for politicians and dominant groups to use. And let's break down a little bit what exactly that power means. So if we have bias on the bottom, and notice that's blue, and we have structural inequity or genocide at the top, you notice that's a combination of blue and red. It's not just pure bias, it's that power. What's that red? What's that power in between? Let's break it down. So that red can often consist of a history of legal discriminatory policies that have present day legacies like segregation and wealth gap. That power consists of disparities in economic outcomes across institutions that are unexplained by economic, cultural, behavioral differences, stereotyping or marginalization by popular culture and political rhetoric, and disproportionately less power, status, and representation. That's what we mean when we say power. Of course, it's going to vary depending on the particular structural inequity and the time and the place, but those are the types of elements that separate racism from bias and structural inequity or structural racism from bias. So looking back again, we know those are those racial binaries are nations that intensified, codified, and weaponized their biases or prejudices, the waves, based on racial phenotype into racism, the tidal wave. And these countries are nations that also have tons of biases and prejudices based on racial phenotype, but they codified them. They never put them into law, okay? Just a quick note, also Christianity played a key role. It was in the development of racism. It was distorted to justify and support slavery and racism. The Bible was distorted by ignoring its social gospel message to morally and religiously justify slavery and later segregation, perpetuate white supremacy, and keep enslaved people subservient. For example, this is Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible. You see, you can argue against people, but you can't argue against God. How you can argue against God in the Bible? If somebody claims that God in the Bible wants racism and slavery, then that's the end, right? So for example, they used the curse of Ham, Noah's curse, to justify the enslavement of Blacks. The entire Southern Baptist Convention exists because they broke away from other Baptist churches for the sole reason of being able to continue to support slavery. The distortion of Christianity Bible ended up permanently affecting the way Southern white Christians understand their faith today. They only follow that personal salvation part, the social gospel message that was stripped out in order to maintain slavery, it continues to be, it's not taught anymore. It's as if it doesn't exist. Two great books about this are The Color of Compromise and White Too Long, if you want to learn more about this. And finally, why racism was developed. Racism was this myth of racial inferiority. It was the story we told, some historians refer to it as. We told this story, or at least white slave owners told this story, to rationalize slavery, their economic interests, and to divide and conquer poor whites and blacks. No more Bacon's Rebellion, social and political interests. So notice that means that racism did not lead to slavery, as many of us assume. I know I assumed that before I started looking into this. It was slavery that led to racism. It was the economic interest that led to these social constructions. And in fact, slavery led to racism, which led to the construction of race, right? That's the only reason race was constructed, in order to justify racism or support racism. And racism was socially constructed to justify the economic interests of slavery. Like as Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, race is the child of racism, not the father. So racism is a story that slave owners told to rationalize slavery. Ironically, it was not slavery, but freedom, the revolutionary new idea of liberty and the natural rights of man, that led to an ideology of white supremacy. Historian Robin Kelly points out the conundrum that faced our founders. The problem they had to figure out is, how can we promote liberty, freedom, and democracy on one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of people who are not white on the other? If it would have been better if America had just looked the world in the eye and said, we hold these people in slavery because we need their labor and we've got the power to do it. That would have been much better, because then when the power was gone, when slavery is over, it's over. But what we said instead was, there's something about these people, meaning they're inferior, because we had to justify, because of those Enlightenment idealists. By doing that, it means that when the slavery is over, that rationalization for slavery remains. And there's some support for this. Historians believe the only other area that developed chattel slavery was the Middle East. And in the Middle East, they did not have Enlightenment ideals, so they did not have to justify slavery. So it was just like, yes, I'm enslaving these people. You and what army is going to take them away from me, right? And the interesting thing is, yes, there's definitely racism in Middle East, but many people would argue it's not as strong as in the United States. That might support this argument. Race, a story first told to rationalize deep social divisions in a society that proclaimed its belief in equality, would be carried forward into the 20th century and beyond. Those laws are over, but all of us are convinced that when we walk out in the world, we see quote unquote races that don't exist. Here's some other support for it. Researchers found that Southerners who are currently living in counties with high historic levels of slavery are much more likely to express racist attitudes than counties that are very similar and next door to them. And they argue that these areas would have had more need to reinforce racist narratives to tell that story of Black inferiority. Also, prior to the Civil War, racist stereotypes justified slavery, so the economic system. So the stereotype of Blacks was that was of Sambos, slow-witted childlike darkies who needed their kind white masters. Slavery was a good thing, they argued. So after slavery was over, I don't know how many of you guys know, but they replaced slavery with another form. It was the slavery by another name, or slavery 2.0. It was the system through a debt peonage and sharecropping and convict leasing, and through pig laws, vagrancy statutes, and unethical sharecropping terms. They achieved mass incarceration of Black men and boys, and from there they leased them out, sometimes to the very same fields where they were working before. And so they continued on slavery for another 90 years. But notice that they achieved the same thing with different economic system. And you notice that the linchpin is mass incarceration. Well, what do you know? After the Civil War, the stereotypes of Blacks changed almost overnight. Suddenly they weren't Sambos anymore. Suddenly they were brutes, savage rapists and criminals that need to be arrested. How convenient. And notice that the brute is the predecessor of today's thug, right? So in both cases, the stereotypes, the racial stereotypes very clearly support and justify the economic system, the economic interests of the time. And it's not just with Blacks. Here's an example with Chinese immigrants. 1850s, Chinese immigrants hired to work in gold mines, potentially taking jobs from white laborers. In the newspapers and in the political speeches at the time, Chinese immigrants are depicted as depraved and vicious, gross gluttons, bloodthirsty and inhuman. Just 1 decade later, Chinese immigrants are hired to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, which was dangerous and white laborers were unwilling to do. Suddenly, Chinese immigrants are sober, industrious, and law-abiding, and very trusty, very intelligent. 1 decade later, Chinese immigrants are competing in the tight antebellum job market. And you could get whiplash. Chinese immigrants are now criminal, conniving, crafty, and stupid. You notice how tightly the stereotypes are based on justified economic systems and incentives. And this is, again, a common pattern. And what other stories of inferiority to blame do we tell ourselves? These stories that we tell to rationalize inequity and oppression. Looking back on US history, we told stories about the Native Americans to justify genocide and mass land expropriation. We told stories about the Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Hawaiians to justify colonization. We told stories about the Japanese Americans to justify internment. We told stories about Mexican Americans to justify deporting 1 million of them citizens during their Great Depression. We told stories about the Jews to block their immigration while they were trying to flee the Holocaust. Well, that's history. We wouldn't do that today, or would we? We tell stories about low-income people to justify poverty and income inequality. We tell stories about Blacks to justify systemic racism. We tell stories about women to justify the gender pay gap. We tell stories about immigrants and refugees. We tell stories about transgender women and about Mexicans and Asian Americans, and it's hard to keep track, right? I used to tell my students, when you hear a story of inherent group inferiority, start looking for who's telling the story and what they get out of the story. You often tell more about the people telling the story than you can about the people who the story was supposedly about. Follow the money or the political interests. And then the other reason they told the story was to divide poor Blacks and whites. And you can see all through the late 19th century, there's this constant message hammered at poor white people. You may be poor, you may have miserable lives right now, but the thing we want you to focus on is the fact that you're white. I think we're losing time, so I'm gonna skip over this slide, but you see that but the point is that after the Civil War, the populist movement, Blacks and whites, poor Blacks and poor whites were organizing together, and they did the same thing. Jim Crow was, some people argue, was used to separate poor whites and poor Blacks and keep them from organizing. President Johnson in the 1960s, you may have heard this quote, "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, he'll empty his pocket for you." Same thing, right? You can see it throughout history. Southern strategy, same thing, that divide and conquer, right? The Republicans convinced poor whites to switch parties from the Democrats to the Republicans by using that divide and conquer, by playing up racism. And you can see that today as well, right? So I've finished. I'm going to summarize this second part. Part two was why were race and racism constructed in the United States. The United States was originally a class-based society. Anti-Black racism is not natural and did not always exist. Race is a socially constructed category of privilege that is constantly evolving, dynamic rather than static. The United States Black-White binary is arbitrary and unique to our nation. Racism equals prejudice plus power, often laws. Racism did not lead to slavery. Slavery led to racism. It was the economic interests of slavery that led to a racial hierarchy and to racist attitudes and stereotypes. And slave owners constructed racism to rationalize slavery, their economic interests, and to win the allegiance of poor whites, and to divide poor whites and blacks. No more Bacon's Rebellion. But I could easily generalize this. In the next slide, I'm going to generalize this because it's a lot of these are patterns that are not specific to Black-white races. They're more general. So instead of asking why were race and racism constructed in the US, I could have more generally asked, why do societies construct categories of privilege, that would be race, and why do we construct systems of systematic discrimination? Racism is an example of that, of course. So more in general, dominant societal groups construct categories of privilege based on perceived societal differences to justify their dominance. These dominant groups often construct systems of systematic discrimination, such as racism, by codifying and intensifying naturally occurring societal prejudices. They do so to protect their economic interests, garner votes, and divide and conquer. Thus, it is often economic and political interests that are driving both social hierarchies and individual prejudice. And then they tell narratives of inherent group inferiority to rationalize this inequity and oppression, or to scapegoat. And now that I've depressed you, I'm going to leave you on one last thought. How racism came to be codified in the United States is a history that tells us something important about the contemporary moment of racial reaction. Racism is not just a psychological proclivity, but a tool of the elite, a deliberate system of legal, political, and economic control. As intimidating as this truth is, it is also in some sense empowering, because our history makes clear that systemic racism as it developed in the United States was not inevitable. It was a series of intentional choices. And if the framework for white supremacy was deliberately built in this country, it can also be deliberately dismantled. Okay, so remember I told you I was going to be, give you heads up that I was going to be asking you to share your reactions in the chat. That's just so that we can get an overview of where everyone's head is at, what everyone's thinking, and then we'll open it up for verbal questions and discussion. But I do want to get a read of the room and let everybody get a read of the room. So this is in the chat. Please share some of your thoughts and reflections. You can write on anything you want, but what are some ideas, or what are some of the biggest ideas you will take away? What connections are you making to either your area of work or your particular societal identity or race, ethnicity, or to your content area that you teach, or prior knowledge, and also do you have any questions for me? So I'll give you all like a minute or two to write something in the chat.
Someone said racism came from before race.
Yes. Oh, I wasn't gonna, you want me to read them out loud?
Oh, no, I was just, it was the first one that came through.
Got it, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Shara. Thanks, Cynthia. The codification through law and persistence of that way of rationalizing it, right? Like, and how the rules changes depending on which community. Did you see that, Ayo? There's a question.
Yeah, I'm reading them now.
Okay.
I have, since I stopped, I can read them out loud.
Okay.
Would you like me to read them, or?
No, go for it.
Okay, I'll start reading. I'm gonna wait a minute though, just so people can write without listening.
Okay.
And I think everyone's seen the prompts, so I can go ahead and close that.
Mm.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open it up now. Feel free to now speak up. I mean, you're welcome to chat, continue writing in the chat if you want to, but let's speak up and open up the conversation. We can see where everybody is. Couple things. We'll be in a better, after we finish the series, we'll be in a better position to start analyzing situations today. So let's wait off. Let's on discussing solutions to racism today, because we don't have all the elements. This is just the first part. It's just one tiny part. We'll be learning a lot more, and then at the end we'll be in a better position to discuss solutions for today. I do want to address one question that came up a couple of times, is that difference between bias and inequity. I think it's an important distinction to make for several reasons. First of all, when we're looking at racism, then to understand that it's not just bias. That's often, I notice a misconception that a lot of people have, that racism is the same thing as bias. It's not. There's a lot of that power, that inequity. And also, I often see people who try to make, to say, for example, I don't know, bias against people with red hair as equivalent to structural inequity against with race or gender or sexuality. Those are, two different things. So with race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, those all have that power element, that pure bias. For example, I don't know, bias against people who are vegetarians. I've actually had people try to argue that they're equivalent. That's pure bias. It's a helpful distinction to understand the two. And then the other thing that's helpful to understand is that distinction across the Americas of countries that have that the skin color bias versus countries that have actual racism. There's a slightly, not to say that skin color bias is really powerful. I've seen data on skin color discrimination in Mexico and Colombia, and it is something fierce. I'm not saying it doesn't have very real consequence. I'm just saying, they're slightly different. We want to deal with them differently. Yeah, I see somebody else talking, and you guys can talk. Maybe, I guess I'm talking too much, I'll shut up, but I was just responding to some of the comments. Yes, that is very powerful to see how huge changes happen brick by brick, and that they don't just one day to tomorrow. And we can see that today. Somebody said you can see that today, and yes, you can. We have seen since 2016, you see, and each law, each change enables another change. And together, if we look at the changes that have happened over several years, you see that same, it's not just and you see the same thing, for example, in other countries where they have genocide. It doesn't happen from one day to the next. It's that brick by brick thing. Okay, I'll shut up.
I have a question, if no one else wants to speak up, about, I feel like I need to completely relearn the history of the Civil War and what I was taught in school and what I remember of that. But from a perspective of slavery, the Northerners were fighting to keep the Union together. And in my memory, a big part of it was ending slavery. But I'm wondering if you can speak at all to what the Northerners' views were towards Blacks and slaves and how they sort of interpreted those feelings in terms of wanting to end slavery and keep the Union together.
So a lot of it was economic because slavery was competition for free labor. They were against slavery. That doesn't necessarily mean they weren't racist, that they didn't have bias. But the economies were very different, right? And the slavery as an economic institution, first of all, it disadvantaged the North because of, like I said, the competition to free labor. And it also, it really it didn't allow for the construction of infrastructure and the whole South was being left behind and sort of a drag on the economy, and they were specializing in only a few. Economically, racism wasn't good for the country as a whole, especially not for the North. We shouldn't confuse that with yes, for some people they had a moral. But I think the economic was stronger than the moral, and even for those who were morally against slavery, a lot of them did not want to live with Blacks. Like, for example, the idea was to ship them off back to Africa, right? Oh, here's a fascinating thing. So remember when the freed, the emancipated enslaved people, some of them were sent to Africa, back to Africa, right? So they landed in what is today Liberia. The capital, they named it, is Monrovia, after President Monroe. So they set up their own colonization. They basically colonized the native Liberians, and so there was basically two strata. So there was the native Liberians on the bottom of various different tribes and nations, and then they had what they call the Americo-Liberians on the top. The Americo-Liberians often had ties to the United States, often sent their sons and daughters to the United States to get educated and join the Black fraternities and sororities. Came back, they had all the wealth. There was like maybe 12. I used to live there. I lived there for 6 years. They had like 12 last names, and then like everywhere you went, the same last names. The governor was the nephew of the Ministry of Finance, who was the cousin of the sister of the president, who was you could not. They had it all, every single position. And eventually, in 1980, there was a coup of the Native Americans against the Native Liberians against the American Liberians, and when they were going around killing people. And when they would stop somebody, they would say, "Speak your language," because everybody spoke English. It was the lingua franca. But if you couldn't speak another language besides English, that meant you were Americo-Liberian. And so for centuries, they kept so it's just fascinating to see. Here's another example. After colonization, after imperialism, after Europeans went back and the African countries got their independence from the Europeans, that what they would call the educated Africans often went to great lengths and used their power and education to reinforce and keep the same systems in place because they benefit from them. In some ways, you can say us educated Black people do the same. We reinforce structural racism because we benefit from it. I'm just showing you some other examples to show you how insidious this and how these forces are. The reality is if we benefit from the system as it is, no matter who we are and no matter who's underneath, if we benefit from it economically, we will reinforce it. got a quiet bunch.
Yeah, I'm just reading the questions, or it's in the chat.
Yep.
I think part of the reason it's quiet is because it's a lot to process, and I applaud you for sharing what you did. You just like, I feel like you just condensed like this one talk could have been like a whole semester.
True,
Like
it's a graduate semester seminar.
Yeah. But I will say, I just wanted to echo what Danielle was talking about, this notion that there's this bizarre misconception that laws and institutions or even science and higher ed are objective, that they are designed to be objective, and that's just not true. And so my comment was, I really appreciated a lot of the examples you provided, because it allows me to try to expand and imagine how a lot of these concepts show up within this educational context. And so in that exercise, I'm just like in a processing kind of moment. But I did appreciate, I specifically like the tidal wave versus like small wave or individual waves. And I think that's something that resonated with me because of how I navigate the world, right? In California, I'm relatively pale Latina. I encounter several waves on a regular basis, but in a different context, it's so difficult and traumatic to be hit by a tidal wave and then the barrage and constants of the little waves after the initial trauma of the tidal wave. And so to me, in a higher ed context, like that's really powerful, and it's important to take into consideration as educators and leaders in this context, because that's the reality of some of our students. It's the reality of some of our faculty. It's the reality of some of our staff members. And, you know, some of us are positioned in a way where we at the very least may be able to provide a floaty, you know, for people to breathe. Because that really is the trauma, or it was for me, right? Getting hit by the tidal wave and then taking a breath and then hit by the little waves and never really being able to get up. And that was a ripe opportunity for people with power in a boat to like throw me like a lifesaver or something. And so I'm trying to imagine, how is it that within this context, which is just the reality, how do I help? How do I contribute? How do I throw the floaty or a lifesaver to somebody who's struggling? And so this is what I'm contemplating. It's hard to, but it's a lot to process.
Well, first I want to mention that I will be sending a PDF copy of this presentation, and Onar will be, I guess, it's somehow, I guess, put it on the website. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, and all the different resources that you can share, I will put them all on the website.
Yes, thank you. So I'll be sending an email with the PDF, and you guys have the recording, so you can rewatch it and break it down. And also I'll be sending, you know, those summary slides. You know, the email will have those summaries, the bullet points, and also links to resources on this subject. So that will help you process and break it down in your different groups. You know, if you want to process and break it down in your groups, or go back over it, different parts. And then, but separately, I wanted to mention about the institutions, or rather, I'm going to give a little, I know I said I wouldn't talk about solutions today, but I do want to address one thing, and that is, I think we are focused too much on bias, and we should be focusing more on economic interests or regulations and rules and laws that incentivize or that support economic and political interests. I think is one of the takeaways. I was going to draw it out later on, but I think to me that is one of the takeaways, that if we just keep, if 95, 98% of our effort is only on bias, yeah, you're not going to get anywhere. Because it's really, I think the key takeaway is that it's really the economic and political interests that drive everything. So you have to, that's what you have to target. And our prioritization is completely opposite. It's like we're chasing after the fact, you know, instead of going to the roots and the source. There's a reason my organization is called Uprooting Inequity. You gotta get to those roots.
Pardon, do you mind, can I speak for just a moment?
Yeah, go for it.
But I think that's precisely, I totally agree with that. And I think that's the biggest problem. That's how we get distracted from the issue. So what you said was perfect. And I wish you could repeat that. And I wish we had something, I wish I had something like that. I could, some slogan like that I could put on my fridge or like on my computer screen every day I wake up to remember, like that's like the mission. Thank you.
We can, like I said, I draw it out in later workshops, but tons and tons of research shows that even among whites who 100% are in support of the principles of racial equality, over 50% of the time in their daily lives, they're reinforcing economic inequity. And in fact, they'll, even in theory, they will not vote against discriminatory laws. You know, it's one thing that it's principle that those, yes, you know, we are all equal. Yes, I'm woke. But reality shows that economic interests went out well, I shouldn't say every single time, but most of the time. That's what has to be addressed rather than the bias. The bias will come afterwards. They even have a name for it. They call it the principal policy gap.
So I wanted to say just a couple of things if I could. First, this was just powerful. Let me just say that. It was extremely educational. It was eye-opening, empowering, and it even made, I know for me personally, it made me just stop to think back to some of my early learning years and say, hey, wait a minute, did we learn it that way? Or do I recall this? I just thought it was just a great eye opener. And I'm hoping at some point in time, we might be able to get you over here in person, and maybe for a full day or maybe for a couple of days, because I think this is, I think the way you presented this subject matter was in a way that makes everybody, no matter what their perspectives are, makes them open their eyes and at least think, particularly that last point you made about the economic aspect of it. I agree with you 100% in that regard there. I do believe that we in this space, I mean, we're constantly challenged, if you will, regarding our usefulness sometimes, because a lot of times people think we're here just to talk about bias, or they think we're here just to talk about discrimination, just to talk about race discrimination and how you made me feel. I mean, those things are very important, and it is part of our job to make sure we eradicate it as much as we can. But certainly there are other vestiges of bias that are beyond personal feelings, but impact how we get mortgages, how we get business loans, how we create businesses, how we create wealth in every endeavor. So I do think that's extremely important. And so I go to educate people about it. It's certainly our goal to. So I would be more than happy to welcome you back here for, I mean, give it a name, a workshop, a summit, if you will, because I just think that we can't just, as we say sometimes, hit it and quit it. We'll come in and have a nice brown bag and go away and say, wow, that was great. And then the next day, everybody's back to business. I mean, I'd like to see something that's transformational. And I think the way you're laying it out. I mean, you take it from almost a primary aspect of just making us, I mean, taking us back to really understand the basics of what most of us either should have been taught or probably some were taught, but most should have been taught in our early years of our education. So I just want to thank you for that. I can go on and on about all the good stuff you said here, but I'm very pleased to have been a part of this aspect today. And I would love to get you back here on something more long-term, if you will.
No problem. You know, I have 4 seminars, right? This is part of a series of 7. And also somebody wrote a semester or a seminar. It just occurred to me, if there's any history or social studies professors on this call who would like to turn the series into a seminar, let's talk. You know, so spread the word. If you know anybody who would be willing to teach a seminar, I would work on with them to turn the entire series into a course.
I would love to say it, because when I look down at the numbers of participants, that's 34. And while 34, sometimes in this work we do, we're happy to get 34 people who attend some of these events. But I'd love to see something where there are 2,000, 3,000. You know, we have 9,100 students here at the university, and that's just students. So when you imagine students and faculty and staff, I'd love something more engaging that we can really touch some minds and hearts, if you will. So I'm more than happy to support funding for such a thing.
Also, I really love the mission of UC Merced that Onar and Cynthia shared with me. So I gave them permission with no extra cost. They are, you have permission to use the recording for a year.
Oh, good.
So you can, as long as it's within the system of UC Merced, you have permission to use it widely. And I'm happy to, if you want me to join, that would be a little bit extra money, but I think, you know, we can talk about joining you for discussions. You know, maybe several different groups could see the recording and then we could have one joint discussion, you know, it's something, I don't know, but you can, you know, we can work together and figure different things out, but I'm willing to work with you guys because I really love the mission and of UC Merced. Important thing is that the information is spread and that we're and used and applied.
So you know what I'd love to see, and I've done this at other locations, and I'll admit, look, if something works, keep it working. I'd love to use this recording, for instance, as a kind of call to action, if you will, and maybe move forward with some other type of action-oriented eradication of racism-related exercise, and whether that's striking down, promoting the striking down of certain laws or even municipal codes or municipal laws, ordinances, even here in the city of Merced, or even state laws. There's some state laws that basically have the impact, and while it may not be apparent on their face, certainly in their application, that the impact could be such that they impact certain groups of people and to a greater extent than others. So I would love to, and I've done that in at least 3 other stops along the way, and it's called Dismantling Racism, and it's worked excellent. And I think this would be a good opportunity for something, because you need something to bring people together first. And I think a group of people sitting in on here and hearing this recording or hearing this presentation, you know, would be motivated enough to say, hey, look, I would love to start this discussion group on how we can dismantle some aspect of structural racism that exists either at the university, within the city, or within the state of California. And you only need about 10 people. And if you've got 10 groups of 10 doing that, they may seek to dismantle 10 different aspects. That's the basics of it. And it's worked perfectly for me in the past, and I'd love to do something similar.
Well, the last workshop, the last seminar in the series is a little shorter. It's like an hour, and that's intentional to leave time because in that last one is called Lessons Learned and Directions Forward. That's when we pull it all together. And it's shorter because it allows more discussion time, because participants will be charged with figuring out a specific law or policy that they want to dismantle or address.
Perfect. That's
So they
exactly.
will be given protected time, possibly in groups, we're still working on it, where they have to identify and commit to doing something. I always encourage it to be something associated with their work, so that it also benefits their work. It makes them a better professional in whatever they are. Like, I don't know, if they're a social worker, then, something related, or to a professor, something that can also at the same time make them a more effective of their profession. But and that's where we would look at. I'm hoping that some people will look at municipal ordinances, look at in the area, in the specific valley, or in where you are.
Great.
I love it. It's very similar concept. I absolutely love it. I can't wait to get to the end now. It's like dessert. Sometimes when you eat dessert before you eat your meal, that's kind of where I am now with this.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Howard. Yes, meeting with IO, this is definitely inspirational in terms of, from implementation to now this is happening, and definitely the seventh session is going to be incredible as we keep 42 people engaged, right? And as marketing of these series will be more now available, and because of your experience, please, I always say, let's expand the table for this great opportunity with IO. And again, thank you again, Dr. Howard, for potentially having IO join us on campus. So, and then as the other piece of the seminar, y'all, is around our commitment to our Bobcat Brilliance, right? Which is part of our OEDI mission. And it's about people's first, anti-oppression and liberation for all. And with that, when we do justice to our faculty and staff, we do justice to our scholars, we do justice to our community. And so the one thing as I was preparing for the seminar is I had an opportunity to attend a webinar from the Kellogg Foundation, Restoring Wholeness, Racial Healing for Ourselves, Our Relationships, and Our Communities. And as the Bobcat community have gone through within the last couple of years of creating these spaces, a quote stems out, and I would love to hear the group and you, IO, a quote: "Before you can transform systems and structures, you must do the people work first." Before you can transform systems and structures, you must do the people work first. So I just really want to open up to everyone, because I think that was very compelling, right? Because there was folks in the chat saying that, this work, it is enduring. It's beautiful, but it also takes a lot of energy, right? And so again, that practice of self-care, that self-reflection, but again, before we can transform systems of structures, we must do the people's work first. So I just want to open it up to anyone who'd like to speak on that. Yes, Donald.
I'd like to say something, and Io, thank you for that presentation. I loved it. I love getting that history. I know some of it, and I'm always learning more. It's always great to see those. I'm a librarian, so seeing those primary documents, you know, what the people really said at the time, not what people say they said or think they said, but what they really said. It's always different than what we think, because we have this, you know, history is a story, and we only get certain parts of the story. So I'm going to tell you a story. I belong to a service club here in town, and it's a mix of people. There's people from the community who are more community type people, and UC Merced people. Not that UC Merced people aren't community, but you know, people who are UC Merced, not UC Merced. And we, in our service club, we had an issue that involved race, and it got really nasty last year. So we started to do some work on it, and as a group, we read White Fragility, and a group of us within the group did that, not all of us. And one of the guys in the group, after we read White Fragility, said, "I couldn't read this book," he said, and he handed out this essay that he'd gotten from Hillsdale College, which is, if you don't know Hillsdale, it's a small college in Michigan that's founded on the principles of objectivism, objectivist philosophy, which is basically Ayn Rand stuff. And the point of this essay, and his point was, all this critical race theory stuff, it's just Marxism. It's just attacking capitalism. I'm never going to accept it. It's about, you know, basically evil white professors manipulating Black people for their advantage. You know, it's always, right? Black people can't rise up on their own. It's always some white troublemaker who's causing it, right? I'm not saying that's, you know, that's kind of their view. And what AO just presented, we know in some states right now, if she was a high school teacher and she presented that in certain states right now, she'd get in trouble. She'd be violating the law as it stands, because they're passing laws against this kind of teaching. So outside of California, but inside of California, we have people who are just not going to accept this. And I'm thinking about what Ayo was saying about this racist thing that happened in our country and our history. It happened a little bit at a time. And to fix it, we're probably going to have to fix it a little bit at a time. We'd like to fix it tomorrow, but we're probably going to have to do it step by step. And so what I would, you know, what I'd love to see, and I know I'm tilting at windmills here, is how do we get this message to people outside of our community of mostly liberal, mostly open-minded university people who are willing to hear this history and go, oh, that's different than what I learned. I'm changing my mind about things, to the kind of people who bought the Republican Southern strategy, who bought the Jim Crow. How do we get the message to those folks? And it's not going to be easy. And I think that goes to Onar saying, you know, you've got to work on the people. How do we get it? How do we make it in a way that they will accept it and not just reject it out of hand? And I don't have the answer, but that's an issue I think that we have to address. We can't just talk to ourselves about it.
Well, not to pat myself on the back, but my approach, I find, is not going to work for, you know, people who are completely, you know, not open. But for moderates, I find that my approach works with moderates who are not open to, what's her name, the White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, and the typical bias approach. I find that people who, there's a group, like a sector in that middle ground, who is much more receptive to my approach to evidence-based, and then to the more typical traditional bias approach.
Right.
I can't, but there's still another group that, you know, that is unreachable from my experience, but helps a little bit to, you know, just to be non-judgmental, non-emotional, just looking through the evidence and figuring out where we are, and also recognizing how universal it is, that human tendency, how human that tendency is. You know, I hate to say this, but you know, from evidence I've seen, even if all white people disappeared today, Black people would reproduce, you know, or, you know, if it was only Black people, we would just reproduce the same thing. I mean, because I mean, you see it in countries where there's only one race. They just find another way to exploit each other and dominate each other. I don't know if that's better. I mean, in a way it's worse, but at least you're saying, look, this is not necessarily a white-Black thing. That's the way it plays out, or white Latino thing that often plays out. That's that's what's being used, right? That then, and if you only focus on the way it's manifesting on then you're going to miss out on the roots. And that's where our focus should be. And we have to work together to work on those economic incentives and to have, because like I said, even if in theory, you got rid of all anti-Black bias today, if you didn't get rid of those economic incentives, again, we'll just find somebody else, you know, to put at the bottom. You can't just look at that bias. You have that, because it's just that bias. Remember, is the bias as it manifests today because of those economic incentives, right? So why do we have bias against X group or Y group? Yeah. We know it's because bias is universal, but it's only our tendency to have a bias. But remember the different groups that we have bias against and the different stereotypes that we have of those come from often economic and political incentives. So if you get rid of those stereotypes, they will just reproduce in different forms.
Well, and sure, and it couldn't, wouldn't it be great if we could get everybody to understand how the Federal Housing Authority loan program has shaped our idea about race in this country, but that's a hard message to get across to people, to say it is really about the money. It is about things like FHA policies and the fact that after World War II, Black people couldn't get loans and white people could. And so white people got houses that are now worth lots of money, and the Black people never had that opportunity to get that. But that's how do we get that story out there? And that's why I like your approach. The historical approach and economic approach is really a way to take it apart from those other things. But it's again, I don't know how to get people to hear that story.
And by the way, that's up next. Number 2 is we're going to be learning about the FHA housing discrimination and redlining. That's in our next seminar. Yeah, I think Molly wrote that bias is definitely part of the picture. Also, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. Yes, we have to work at hearts and minds because somebody has to change those laws, right? You can't unless you change the minds and a lot, because people have to vote in favor of those laws. So I'm definitely not saying that bias is not definitely part of the picture. I'm saying, like, right now, I think we need a little bit more balance, because it seems like oftentimes in different institutions, it's like 95% of focus is on the hearts and minds, with zero, or very little or no focus on those, economic and political roots. We have to address both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to comment just on at the local, like the most local level in this seminar, at the university level, I think there's a lot of work we could do in faculty hiring, retention, staff hiring, retention, the treatment of our students, in the actual policies. It's one thing to train each other and we all love and kumbaya, but we need it to be codified. Like you said, Ayo, it was made this way by laws and regulations, and it's systematized. And I think that's something that we can rally around a little more, especially in these groups, because we all know, we care, we all understand just the gravity of the situation, but now we need to kind of put it into the action, put it into the local policy, even at the university level. And we could branch out to the Merced City. But even just starting here, I think, is an undertaking of itself.
Yeah, all laws, regulations, practices, policies at the federal, state, local, municipal, and institutional and departmental level are often baked through, yes, by bias, but more importantly, perhaps to keep certain groups to preserve the status and privilege of certain groups. I mean, and lots of times it has to do with race and ethnicity, but other times it doesn't. Even, for example, I've been reading some studies about how many job positions demand a college degree for positions that don't need a college degree. Why? It's because those of us who have college degrees, we benefit from this system, and we want our kids, and those of us who have the context and the experience and the money to we know our kids are going to be in college, so we work either consciously or unconsciously to maintain a system, the policies and practices that keep those who are educated, to make sure that we have keep our piece of the pie, the way, how we benefit from the system as it is. So we will work to reproduce it. And that's all of us. That's me. That's you, every single one of us, right? And so those rules and practices, like you said, aren't objective, right? They maintain a certain hierarchy and status and advantages, and they disproportionately impact people who are low income, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, etc. But anybody, women, anybody who has less privilege in society. But yes, they're baked into every single policy and practice at every level.
I just wanted to note really quickly, I think when Onar you said the quote about the work of people, what came up for me during the training is just the different ways that still an ethic of caring, compassion, and collusion even broke out in these historical ways, even just talking about the threat of rebellions or people from groups that were intentionally divided or stratified being able to come together, collude, escape, snatch dignity. And I actually find that somewhat inspiring, right? That if there is the potential and the possibility for that, even when the actual system of stratification was being constructed, that the potential for that ethic, that level of collusion, that level of that snatching dignity, that escaping is still possible kind of throughout any time. And so I just found that as one of the things that just reminded me of that people care, that personal care, that we can focus on both the systemic and then also find our ways to support each other, kind of do what we can do in our moments at the same time, and find a balance between those two factors.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lauren. Great. Other comments, questions, shares?
Onar, I don't know if you want to, I'm not saying you have to, but you may want to copy, I don't know if you want to copy the chat before you hang out.
Yeah, it actually adds it to the file.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
Great.
Okay, great. And as you all know, this is the first year we're doing this, and so part of the idea that I shared with IO was, if people are interested enough, and I will email all the folks who have registered, if there is enough interest for us to do a little brown bag, right, to continue the conversation, because it's every other week, so that off week would be our opportunity to to gather, right, to process, to debrief, right, and as we get to know more, we get more information and share that space. So again, just showing up interest, I will create another Zoom meeting, so everyone can, folks who can join are able to do that. So we can do that off week and see how it goes, right? Because we know that coalition is a key strategy for transformation, right?
Yeah, that would be a great way to bond and to create unity, and that could work as a what's it called? Stomping off point. Help me out. What's that expression?
The springboard we talked about. Yeah.
Yes, springboard. I had the same problem last time. I couldn't figure out that word, didn't I?
I got you.
From there so that you can, then you can act, you know, yeah, that's a great idea.
Yes, Elijah, everything will be available on the website, on those specific seminars, and whatever recording resources will be on that. Thank you for your question.
Please share, please tell others, and do ask them to watch the recording of this one before they show up for the next one. So please spread the word, and so they can join us. Like you said, the bigger the group we have, then more is possible.
Yeah. Right.
I just want to jump in and say thank you so much. Thank you, Onar. Thank you, Ayo. Thank you, everyone, for participating. When it comes to the work that OEDI does, we need this information. We need to process and unpack it and really get intimate with it, because we know where we're trying to go. But the gratitude we have, Ayo, for you sharing not only this module, but all of the incoming 6 downstream, I know it's gonna equip us even more so to do the work that we're trying to do. So very happy this came to fruition. And again, a super thanks, double shout out to Onar for putting this all together.
Yes, thank you,
Very
Onar.
happy, very happy.
Ooh, that's nice. Donald said this was even better than I thought it would be, and I was expecting it to be great. Ooh!
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks everybody.
Yeah, and just remember the next one is September 22nd. Sign up. Same thing, right? You'll get an email. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ayo.
Thank you.
Right.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
Thank you.
How is it? How do you feel?
Good. Good.
Session 1 done. Look at the comments. Look at the attendance.
Yeah, I was going to share with you. I was putting timestamps on how many, like, right from 2 p.m. we had 42 and 39, 36, and then 28 by the last couple of minutes.
People stayed, right? Okay. So excellent. I hope you can celebrate this for the rest of the day, because it takes a lot of energy to do that. So make sure you unwind.
Yep.
We'll talk about things to address in the second meeting. Just remind them, like, this is a certificate. You can earn it.
Right.
I think that's the only thing you didn't hear today.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I was taking notes too, like especially for resources, etc. Right? Just to map it out in the very beginning, so folks will have that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
good job.
Thank you. No.
Rejoice.
Okay.
Enjoy it.
I hear you.
Enjoy it, and congratulations. 1 of 7 complete.
And I
Good job.
appreciate it. I appreciate all your support.
You're welcome.
Okay,
Take care.
bye.